All right, so we are now joined by Matt Huber. He is an associate professor of geography at Syracuse University. He's also author of the book Lifeblood, Oil, Freedom, and the Forces of Capital. And of course, his new book is Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet. We'll be talking to him about that today. Matt, it's good to see you.
Great to be here. Great to see you, Jen.
So let's just dive in. You argue in your book that climate struggle is, in many ways, a class struggle. And I think what's interesting is you point out that it's not just because, capitalists are overwhelmingly causing climate change and workers are overwhelmingly bearing the brunt, although, of course, that is one major component. But I think what's really interesting about your book is you talk about how the fight over climate is ultimately a fight over ownership and production. And that's another significant way in which it is a class struggle. So start there. Explain what that means.
Yeah, part of this analysis came out of a bit of frustration with seeing a lot of people on the left sort of claiming climate is a class struggle, but then using data that just shows that rich people consume more than working class people, and they consume yachts, or they consume steak, and it was completely like to be frank, not a Marxist analysis of class. It's based on people's income and their consumption and their lifestyle. And it actually struck me, like, if you honestly look at the climate crisis and what we need to do, it's like a world historical struggle over how we produce the world, our food, our energy, our housing. So the people that actually own and control the means of production, but like, you take this kind of classic Marxist definition of class as who owns and controls the means of production. To me, that just seemed like that was a much more accurate way to analyze what the climate crisis is about. It's about really wrestling control over production from a class that's really just seeking profit as long as possible, particularly the fossil fuel industry, who's counting on profiting off this energy source well into this century, and they want to do so against all opposition. So that sort of class analysis, a very kind of standard socialist vision of class analysis, would just seem sort of absent in the analysis. So I tried to really ground the book in that framework.
So why do you think it's been so hard to kind of emphasize the role of capitalist production in this larger problem of climate change? Why do you think it's been the case that climate politics has been not exclusively, but sort of largely, at least until pretty recently, focused on things like, consumerism, as you were saying, and individual lifestyle choices?
Yeah, it's in many ways, I think we live, particularly in a country like the United States, that's gone through, massive hollowing out of industrial production itself, has gone through widespread deindustrialization, where the industrial working class has been, shrunk to a large degree. And, you often hear, like, in the United States, like 70% of GDP is consumption. So I feel like people, only see in their lives their consumption patterns. They see consumption on the surface of their everyday lives. It's what they do. And so when people are telling them, like, all these acts of consumption are linked to emissions, when you trace the connections, people sort of start to say, well, all this consumption that I see is causing climate change. And what really helped me actually is when you go to volume 1 of Capital, Marx is like, we actually have to look at what he calls the hidden abode of production to understand where exploitation happens, understand where workers are struggling against capitalists in the factory, at the point of production. And actually, what he points out is that we see the market exchange and consumption on the surface of life, but we don't understand the real roots of capitalism are in production. And so that analysis, I didn't try to reinvent the wheel, just said we have to look at the hidden abode of what's causing the climate crisis. And even if, we might be driving a car that's emitting carbon out of our tailpipe, why aren't we paying attention to the owner of the car company that sold us the car, or not to mention the owner of the oil that sold us the gasoline that we put into the car? So every act of consumption can be traced back to these people that are profiteering off those acts of consumption, who to be honest, are, they're making the money on these exchanges. And so that, in my view, they're the ones truly benefiting from those kind of relationships. And so, yes, but you really have to start, doing kind of political economic analysis to even really understand those relationships to production. Because again, people, when all they see is consumption and everyday life, they often, it doesn't make sense to kind of think through these deeper connections to that hidden abode of production.
So maybe talk a little bit more about what it would mean for the climate movement to sort of shift focus to production, or to these relations of production. Because I think, it's clear at this point that I think, for a lot of us on the left, the kind of limitations of focusing on consumerism or, the caricature being like, just turn off the lights. I think lots of people who, identify as part of the climate left kind of understand that that's not going to cut it anymore, or that's, if anything, just a drop in the bucket. So what does it mean to actually shift a political strategy to focusing on production?
Yeah, so I think in one sense, there's just still so much of this moral politics of lifestyle. And so even when people say, yeah, we don't want to focus on individual consumption, they'll still kind of moralize about rich people and their consumption, right?
Right.
Which ignores how these rich people make all the money that affords their consumption, right? And that activity of the money making, who knows what they do in their work life to make all that money that allows them to consume a private jet or whatever it is. So to me, it makes it politically more clear what we need to do. Instead of morally persuading millions of dispersed consumers to kind of change their lifestyle, we actually have to sort of confront the power of, a small minority of people who control production. Now, that's simpler, I think, from a political point of view. It's very clear. It's the capitalist class. We need to confront them. It's possibly not easier.
Right.
It's not easy at all. But I think it really just allows us to possibly to start to build a broader base for this kind of politics, because I think the moralistic shaming around your lifestyle is not really winning over a lot of people who already feel like they're struggling, especially now with inflation and decades of wage cuts and austerity and debt. And so, as I argue in the book, this sort of moralistic lifestyle politics was always really appealing to a professional class who was, pretty comfortable, relatively speaking, having sort of a middle class, secure existence. And from that perspective, it just seems like, oh God, I'm part of this machine that's causing climate change, and we need to get everyone to stop consuming like I do. And so it just seems like it's logical from that very middle class, professional class perspective. But if we want to build a broader base in the working class to actually win them over, we have to say, you're not the problem. Your consumption is not the problem. In fact, it's sort of classic socialist analysis. The working class, they don't own much but their labor power to sell on the market. And so they don't control our system of energy. They don't control the grid. They don't control the systems of oil distribution. And so we should not blame people in their everyday lives. And we should make clear, like one of our favorites, Bernie Sanders, it's the billionaires that are to blame, and it's their power we actually need to confront and overcome with a sort of positive vision of when we overcome their power, it can actually improve people's lives and not ask you to scale back or consume less or lower your carbon footprint and all of this kind of stuff that's really popular amongst that professional class.
Yeah, I definitely want to stay on this topic of the professional class for a minute, because this is obviously a very key part of your book. You've appeared on the Jacobin channel before to talk about this, and of course have written for Jacobin and Catalyst. So talk to us about how the professional class sort of came to dominate the climate movement. And then you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe say a little bit more about how this seems to be getting in the way of sort of building a viable strategy to fight climate change.
Right. So what I mentioned before, you have this process of deindustrialization and the hollowing out of the industrial working class, and obviously the processes we're all familiar with, like attacks on unions and but alongside that, you also have just sort of this explosion of higher education in a country like the United States, where you have more and more people kind of trying to use degrees and other credentials to kind of carve out advantages in the labor market. And so in the post-war period, and then accelerating in the kind of neoliberal period of the 80s and 90s, you get this kind of explosion of kind of higher credentialed professional class aspirant type folks. And, the original theorization by Barbara and John Ehrenreich of the professional managerial class, they were actually trying to grapple with the kind of large amount of these professional managerial class people in the New Left, in the movements, particularly the socialist movements that they were trying to build themselves. And they were trying to kind of maybe understand how that explosion of the PMC in the New Left might be one reason why it was kind of sputtering at the time in the late 70s. And one thing they identify is that there's nothing wrong with the presence of professional middle class people in left movements and socialist movements. In fact, when the socialist movement was at its most powerful, had plenty of these people in the parties and in the unions. The problem was that this particular kind of PMC politics was kind of shaped by this kind of contempt of the masses and of the working class. And they argue there's this sort of antagonism that emerges between the PMC and the working class. And that's a real problem. So what I try to do in the book is kind of show how there's all these varieties of professional class climate politics. I try to do this like typology. There's the science communicators who are trying to really, talk about, we need to believe the truth of the science. And the problem is climate denial and all these people denying the science. And, obviously, if you're a non-college educated working class person working 2 to 3 jobs, like science and the greenhouse effect and what the carbon cycle looks like is not exactly on the top 10 of your most pressing concerns. And there's, what I call the policy technocrats who are, gonna design all these really elegant market-based policy fixes for climate change, like carbon taxes or cap and trade. And all of that kind of assumes that we're gonna kind of raise the price of energy across the economy, which, and there's a lot of clever ways to kind of redistribute those prices that don't harm the poor. But in the end, when your political message is we're going to raise the price of a key good that everyone relies on, that's not going to win over the working class. We saw in France, basically a mass political revolt against climate policy and carbon taxes. And in the United States, liberals have been trying to pass type carbon tax policies, particularly in the state of Washington. And these things fail. They're not popular. People don't like this idea of like internalizing carbon emissions into prices and correcting the market. And then the final, the one I'm probably most familiar with is what I call the kind of radical anti-system activist who subscribe to kind of like either like this sort of like degrowth vision of consuming less and these kind of niche, small scale kind of political solutions like urban gardens and bike sharing and small scale local kind of communal experiments, which again are, I think, really fulfilling for the participants, but are not exactly mass popular things. Like not everyone wants to farm in an urban garden and like do sort of communal kitchens in their neighborhood. And so all of these things kind of make a lot of sense to these professional class advocates, but they don't really have mass appeal. They're really more appealing to these small minoritarian factions in the highly educated, let's say generously, 25% of society in the United States. That's where this kind of politics really circulates and has appeal and spreads, but it doesn't get much beyond those groups.
Yeah, I want to stay on this last group that you identified for a second, the kind of radical wing of the PMC climate activists, because this group is really interesting because ostensibly they're anti-capitalist, right? Or a lot of them
Yes.
kind of identify as such.
Yeah.
Now, you brought up this concept of degrowth, and I want to talk about that a little bit because I think it is popular among this kind of set of the climate movement. Uh, Tell us, what exactly does degrowth mean, and what do you think are the kind of overarching problems with that strategy?
So there's a lot to say. I mean, in many ways, it's a sort of response to, we do live in a capitalist society that fetishizes GDP growth as like the one barometer of kind of a healthy political economy. If GDP's up, we sort of say, hey, things are going well for this. And it just sort of says, well, no, growth is what is causing all these environmental problems. And so we should actually do the opposite, degrowth. And if I can remember off the top of my head, I think the latest definition is something like a planned reduction of energy and material throughput while making life better for ordinary people or something like that. I'm sorry, I should have this written down somewhere where I can reference it. But the thing that really I kind of get frustrated with is it's always focused on the aggregate. Like we're going to degrow at the aggregate, which to me, the problem with GDP as a concept to begin with is that it focuses on the aggregate, and it actually confuses the fact that a capitalist society is fundamentally divided between classes. Mm-hmm. So if GDP is going up 3%, that doesn't tell us a lot about how the working class is doing.
Right.
It tells us that firms are profiting, they're doing well, and they're investing, and they're hiring people. And that can be good for working class people. It does sometimes happen where growth can be redistributed to working class people. But it fundamentally sort of obscures the fact we're in a fundamentally divided class struggle society where some benefit at the expense of the masses. And so when you're doing a class analysis, this sort of aggregate view doesn't make a lot of sense. So for I think degrowth has a lot of policy proposals I would agree with, like universal, they actually would support Medicare for all. They would support decommodifying housing and things like, and sort of focusing on people's basic needs, which I do agree with. But when your message is always about less and reduction, and one of the slogans they have is how to live better with less. It's just like, that's not, from a purely messaging standpoint, that's not particularly helpful, again, to build a mass base for the movement.
Right, that just sounds like austerity.
Exactly. But it's also just not an accurate way to analyze a class society which has a struggle between classes. So you can't say, let's all live better with less and let's degrow at the aggregate. You have to say we need to degrow the rich so that we can grow the working class. And actually, again, if we see climate struggle as this class struggle over industrial production, that we need to kind of fundamentally change our industrial system, that's going to require growth of a whole lot of stuff, including new energy infrastructure, new public transit infrastructure. It's going to be massive growth, actually, of all this stuff. And then the degrowthers will say, oh, yeah, we know we got to grow some things, but overall we're going to degrow. And it's not helpful. So let's focus on the class struggle analysis and not this aggregate sort of politics of less, is how I frame it in the book.
So on the subject of growing or trying to build sort of like large scale public works programs, something that you've written about, not just in your book, but also recently for Jacobin with friend of the show, Fred Stafford, is the New Deal, right? The New Deal, I think, provided obviously some pretty useful blueprints for, as I was saying, these large scale public investment and infrastructure programs. And of course, is the kind of progenitor of the Green New Deal, which we should definitely talk about in a second. But I want to ask you about one specific New Deal program, which is, of course, the Tennessee Valley Authority. That's what you recently wrote about for Jacobin.
Yeah.
talk to us about what the TVA is exactly, what kind of state it's in now, and whether you think it's still a sort of useful model for a green energy program.
Yeah. So the TVA is like, when you go back to the Bernie Sanders campaign, you would see a lot of overlap. Like the TVA's slogan in the 1930s was electricity for all. We've heard that before, haven't we? And so it was this really populist vision of delivering this, what we now take for granted, electricity, which was totally out of reach to masses of people, particularly in rural areas. And it said, we're going to build these hydroelectric dams, and we're not just going to send electricity to poor people. They were really big on cheap electricity for the masses. Like they wanted, because they were really concerned by these capitalists who controlled what we now call investor-owned utility sector. And they were actually these sort of robber baron monopolists who really were price gouging consumers. And they didn't even find it profitable to deliver electricity to these rural areas. And so the TVA was like, not only are we going to deliver this electricity, we're going to deliver cheaper electricity than these capitalists can, and we're going to outcompete them in the market. And so it was, and obviously it was this total public works program that employed masses of people in the depths of the Depression who were desperate for work. It gave them meaningful work to do to build this infrastructure. And it wasn't just in the Tennessee Valley. They did this kind of model in the Pacific Northwest. And people have heard me say this over and over again. I just love to bring up that Woody Guthrie was hired, the folk singer was hired by the New Deal to kind of sing songs about the rivers doing work for the people and kind of like inspiring songs about electricity and how the New Deal was bringing stuff to poor people and downtrodden people. And it's just really striking. There's just nothing like that in the climate policy space today that you could imagine folk singers singing inspiring songs about, like carbon taxes or whatever's on the agenda. I think the latest exciting proposal is something called the Clean Electricity Performance Program that Joe Manchin, of course, killed.
Yes.
So the TVA and the wider kind of rural electrification administration was this just incredible vision that actually models what we need to do, which is fundamentally change and reshape our energy system in the climate moment. But what we show in the piece is that a lot of people on the climate left today are actually quite critical of the TVA because it sort of represents this model that can be quite problematic, which are big centralized investor-owned utilities, whereas TVA is a big centralized public utility. And these utilities in the private sector have shown a real reluctance to shift away from fossil fuels. And TVA has actually cleaned up their grid quite considerably. It's something like 55 to 60% totally zero carbon, a lot of it hydro, some nuclear, very little bit of solar and wind. And the climate left is so fixated on this kind of really technically hard to achieve goal of 100% renewable energy. So we're going to transition to all solar and wind. And accompanying that vision, they really are much more into this kind of decentralized, small scale, kind of like the degrowth vision, like this sort of niche localist. We're going to have small solar farms and we're going to have, everyone's going to have a little solar panel on their rooftop. And it's going to be this decentralized, community-owned, small-scale vision of renewable energy and so because TVA is servicing millions of customers and trying to figure out how to deliver electricity reliably, they have basically committed to a marginal increase in natural gas, which is fossil fuel. And so the climate left just is attacking them and saying, you don't need to do this. You can just go 100% into solar and wind. And we just think this is a misplaced critique. We're going to need these kind of big, centralized public utilities to deliver the energy transition. We can't do it with this kind of ad hoc, small scale, localist vision of decentralized energy because climate change is not to mention a national, but a global planetary problem. And if we have to take over our energy system one local community at a time, we're just not going to be able to do it. So we actually think this vision from the 1930s of big federally supported centralized public utilities, what we call big public power, like that's this kind of model that can really transform our energy system in the speed and at the scale that we really need to confront climate change.
That brings up another question, which is, when you talk about the TVA and when you talk about production, that kind of leads me to this question of whether some sectors are more strategic than others to kind of focus on or organize, right? And I believe in your book, you identify the electrical utility sector as kind of this key linchpin, I guess, in sort of the struggle to the climate struggle. Talk about why the electric sector is so important, and then how can the left go about transforming this sector, and what kind of role do you think the labor movement can play?
Yeah, great. So I totally drew from a lot of analysis you've had on this show, like Jane McAlevey and Paul, who everyone in the labor movement kind of recognizes that it would be great if we could organize the whole labor movement across the board and get the working class moving at the whole level of the working class. But that's not really how it works. Typically, you really want to organize in what Jane would call strategic sectors. And she really goes back to the New Deal, and she shows that the CIO, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations, they said, we're going to focus on the steel industry, coal, we're going to focus on auto, and we're going to organize in these sectors because these are kind of the linchpins of the economy. And if we can win union power here, we can kind of strategically use the strike weapon to force a crisis in those key industries and then transform labor relations for the whole working class. And Jane McAlevey has suggested that in our current day of, again, a very deindustrialized kind of context, she identified strategic sectors of education, healthcare, which we've seen a ton of militancy lately in the labor movement, and logistics, which we're starting to see with Amazon, a little more militancy. But I tried to use this kind of theory of labor organizing in a strategic sector and try to apply it to the climate movement. Because when you look at climate change from a technical perspective, essentially everyone agrees that basically decarbonizing our energy starts with the electric sector, starts with electricity. And what we want to do is massively clean up our electric sector and then what's called electrify everything else that we don't use electricity for. So like transportation, we want to move towards electric vehicles. If you have a natural gas furnace in your home, we want to move toward electric heat pumps. And there's a lot of industrial production applications that we could, if not totally electrify, find clean energy ways to produce with clean electricity. And so this electrify everything strategy really puts electricity at the linchpin. And a lot of climate left people realize this, but what climate left people don't say enough is that sector, the electric utility sector, is one of the most unionized in our country. It has close to 25% union density. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the Utility Workers Union of America are really powerful unions in this very sector that we need to transform. And when you look around in the climate organizing, there's not a lot of work being done to really win over these unions to a more kind of radical climate program that would actually argue we need to radically transform this electric system as fast as possible so that we can solve this global crisis of climate change. What you do see is a lot of the professional class activists are sort of assume those unions are bad and immoral. Some of them might be Trump supporters, and that the leadership of these unions are conservative and they're bad people. So they almost write them off and don't want to engage with them. But it's astonishing because these workers, I think you had Lee Phillips talk about this, like an industrial union. These are the workers that know how these systems work more than anyone. And they're the ones that actually have the knowledge and expertise to really understand how an electric grid system works and how we could actually transform it to not only clean it up and decarbonize it, but also deliver this vital service to people. And that's something electricity workers really take a lot of pride in, that they are delivering this, life enhancing and sometimes life saving service to people. And they really care about things like grid reliability. And so it's not going to be easy. But what I suggest in the book is that if you're in a climate movement, first you should be working with these unions. They should have a seat at the table, but not only that, they should have like the core driving seat at the table. They should be really shaping the agenda of whatever public power campaign you're on or anything like that. And also, for people that have thought about the labor movement in this way of like, there's these strategic sectors. DSA is focused on this kind of rank and file strategy where people can actually get jobs in these unions and try to build a kind of more radical militant organizing culture in those unions themselves to try to transform them from the inside. And I actually think there's a really good argument that climate activists could make to these unions, which is that if they don't start organizing proactively about this looming energy transition, that actually when you look at what's happening in the energy space today, like a lot of renewable energy production and renewable energy development is actually quite anti-union and it's quite owned by private capital. And so if the electrical unions are not proactive, they're going to be kind of swept away by this kind of Wall Street-led green capitalism. Yeah. And so they actually have an interest for their members and their unions themselves to kind of think strategically about how this climate crisis and how this energy transition can be led by unions and really driven by unions in ways that benefit their members and grow their unions. Because if we're going to electrify everything, we're going to build massive amounts of new infrastructure, and that should hopefully mean massive amounts of union jobs. And as much as Joe Biden says that's going to be the case, like we actually need real legal sort of forces that mandate that those jobs are union jobs.
Right.
And so there's a real opportunity there to kind of build this movement within the labor movement in the industrial sector we need to transform.
I want to ask you now about the Green New Deal because, on the subject of kind of the relationship and the occasional tensions between activists and labor, the Green New Deal is a really interesting project because, it's really kind of the centerpiece legislation of, a lot of progressive politicians and much of the climate left now. And it directly references kind of these big sort of like sweeping public works programs that we were talking about earlier. And to me, it sort of signals that there is at least a significant part of the climate left that is very interested in, being pro-labor and pro-working class and kind of trying to put together, again, New Deal sort of style coalition of public investment. Right. Now, that said, something you alluded to, the Green New Deal really hasn't found much sweeping support outside of the climate movement just yet. Right. What would it take to make something like the Green New Deal a real political possibility? I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is there seems to be a lot of good intentions when it comes to the Green New Deal. You've got all of these politicians and climate activists who, have sort of started to signal that they're very pro-labor and they really want to kind of forge these alliances with the existing labor movement to try to craft, again, a model of public investment. But something seems to be going on. So what's happening with the Green New Deal?
Wow. I mean, I have to say, like, when it came on the scene in 2019, when so many years ago, when AOC, helped the Sunrise Movement occupy Nancy Pelosi's office, and they're calling for green jobs for all, and they're calling for a Green New Deal. I was really so excited by this because I finally saw an upsurge of a political movement that was fundamentally about climate policy will improve your life. They were talking about, AOC's original resolution talked about, Medicare for all, everyone, a job guarantee, and real universal material benefits for everyone that would be part of this program, which is, again, a lot of what the New Deal ushered in, right? Social Security, union rights, all this kind of great universal social programs. But the problem is the whole theory of change with the Green New Deal is that once you start to deliver these universal public goods under the name of climate action, then you're going to start to build these popular majorities around climate action. Because people they won't need to understand the science of the carbon cycle or the greenhouse effect to understand that, guaranteed good government job or green public housing or Medicare for all, that if these programs start to actually be delivered to the masses of people, they're going to find support. And we've seen that over and over again. Whenever the government kind of creates a universal program, people like them, right? Yeah. And so, but the problem is if you don't deliver those types of programs, then you can't start to build those popular majorities, start to build those working class coalitions around your program. And so while the Green New Deal was a great idea, I still say it'd be a great idea if we actually tried it, right? Because essentially we all, not to relitigate, but we all know what happened. Bernie Sanders was the more kind of, I would say, Green New Deal candidate. He lost. Mm-hmm. And for all of Biden's bluster about being a climate president, his program, which a lot of climate activists got behind and thought was good with the Build Back Better, was essentially a bunch of tax credits for private capital to develop renewable energy. Right. And it was a world historic level of tax credits. Like they were going to spend like $600 billion on these tax credits. But there wasn't enough of that Green New Deal vision of public sector led investment, public sector building of these, beautiful New Deal projects. They didn't just build dams, they built libraries, they built museums, they built music amphitheaters. Like they built all this stuff that actually a lot of us still benefit from today. There's this wonderful Living New Deal project that just sort of tries to trace all the infrastructure that we still rely on. Yes. And so that kind of vision got lost. And again, I think I mentioned this before, a lot of the climate activist community really put their whole organizing around this wonky solution to our electric power program called the Clean Electricity Performance Program. And it was going to be this wonky regulation that forced decarbonization in the electric sector. But it had none of this, public goods, material benefits, inspiring public infrastructure, had none of that. So Biden unfortunately lost the whole Green New Deal vision. And then, of course, even his lame climate agenda didn't even get through because Joe Manchin came in and blocked that. So unfortunately, we're in a situation now where we're so far from power that implementing this kind of vision that the Green New Deal people had is just off the table right now. So the only thing we can hope is that the political conjuncture will shift in the coming decade into a place where we might be able to actually implement it, right? Because again, we never implemented it. and we can't, the theory of change won't work unless you start to implement those public goods.
Right. So I think then maybe a last question for you is, where do you see the most promise right now for kind of reorienting the climate movement towards these more productive ends that you were talking about?
Yeah, when Bernie lost, I think all of us were like, well, that's really awful. So now all we can do is do what the left really should always be doing, which is go back to the labor movement, go back to trying to rebuild the union movement, try to rebuild. So I actually think this kind of climate activism that really takes the electric and not just, I would say I kind of think maybe a bit too narrowly in the book about electricity. Like we should think broadly about the building trades as a whole. I think as Lee Phillips does in that great article, like we should just try to win over a big swath of unions to this climate agenda. And actually, the Green New Deal people did a decent job of doing that, but they won over typically like the unions you would expect to support climate action, which are the teachers unions and the nurses unions. Those are the first unions that actually endorsed the Green New Deal. And so we're going to build these alliances with what I would call like the low carbon sectors of like these forms of care work and knowledge work where obviously they're going to support climate action, but we actually need to build support within that more belly of the beast, like the industrial heart, the hidden abode, if you will, of all this production of electricity, of energy, and of buildings and industrial infrastructure that's going to be at the core of any climate transition. And so that's where we have to focus on today, and then hope that the political winds shift in such a way that allows for a kind of mass push for that kind of Green New Deal vision down the line.
All right. Again, Matt Huber's new book is Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet. That is out now from Verso. Matt, thank you so much for your time. It was great to see you.
Yeah, I love the show. It's great to be on with you, Jen.
Thank you, Matt. If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.